Oh, perfect. And with me today, we have Shannon Carpenter, and she'll introduce herself later, Yara Gonzalez, as well as Andrea Horstman. StateCon Troy Daniel is not able to attend today. Unfortunately, he has another call that he must attend. So with that, we can get started. Again, welcome to the MRBI NWQI meeting. And I apologize in advance. I've got two screens going, so you'll probably see me looking left and right throughout. Make sure I'm clicking on the right slide here, so bear with me. So our first slide is our agenda. I'm going to provide the initiative backgrounds of both MRBI and NWQI. Again, Shannon Carpenter will cover the technical requirements of those two initiatives. And Andrea Horstman will cover CSP, the programmatic items, along with Yara Gonzalez covering EQIP. And again, we'll save time for the end to answer any questions that you all may have. So go to the next slide here. Okay, so what is MRBI? MRBI actually, the goal of MRBI, the purpose is to improve water quality and assist states in implementing their nutrient reduction strategies, and those strategies are associated with the Hypoxia Task Force Action Plan. So NRCS designates these focused watershed, which are at the HUC 8 level, and they will align with the state's priorities for nutrient reduction. These focused watersheds typically represent those that contribute the most or the greatest nutrient loads to the Gulf of Mexico. So we do have those HUC 8s, which I'll show you a map later on of what those focus watersheds are. But then within that, MRBI targets smaller priority watersheds. So those are the HUC 12s that you will be presenting in your proposals, which Shannon will cover in more detail later. And so with that, the goal is to have landowners and producers implement practices that improve water quality, restore wetlands, enhance wildlife habitat, while sustaining that agricultural profitability. And with that, two of our covered programs are eligible under MRBI, so Environmental Quality Incentives Program and Conservation Stewardship Program. Okay. So then with that, how does MRBI work? Again, it's states that are within the Mississippi River Basin. They develop the nutrient reduction strategies to minimize the contributions of nitrogen and phosphorus to the Gulf of Mexico. So the funding is available for HUC 12 watersheds, again, which would be in your proposal.
I'll see if I'll try to monitor it.
I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, Keith, if you want to mute whoever just joined. Thank you. It's delivered through a multi-year implementation plan. Prior to the implementation plan, there needs to be a readiness plan, which again, Shannon will cover. But this implementation plan is developed with the state conservationist and then state and local partners. So they do come to an agreement on what this implementation plan will look like. So these implementation plans will target annual results with treatments utilizing the watershed assessments. And of course, the goal, again, is still the nutrient and sediment loss within these critical areas. And then the implementation plans will also include quantifiable metrics for each of the watersheds. And that's related to the primary water quality concerns that can be reported annually. So these capture the progress that is being made in these HUC 12. And the three main components that MRBI is addressing is avoiding, controlling, and trapping. So practices that are implemented to reduce the amount of nutrients flowing from ag land to waterways. So again, those practices target avoiding, controlling, and trapping. Okay, so in this map, you can see the focus areas of Minnesota that are eligible for MRBI. The blue were the original focus areas that Minnesota had in place. We submitted new focus areas to National this past year, and National approved the new ones in green, which really increased the area of Minnesota that is now eligible. Now, right now we have one project area. It's the Goose Lake project. And you can see that there are multiple HUC 12s in this project. That is allowed if the HUC 12s are connected with one another. So as you submit your proposals, please consider that as an option if you're wanting to target more than one HUC 12. All right. So then with MRBI, or excuse me, NWQI, the purpose is to, again, work with producers and landowners to implement practices as part of an area-wide effort to improve our water quality, again, in high priority areas. So these areas, once again, HUC 12, and they can be there can be multiple HUC 12s in the project, again, as long as they are touching one another. So NWQI is designed to help producers take actions to reduce runoff of sediment, nutrients, and pathogens into surface waters where water quality is a critical concern. The practice implementation is focused on those identified areas within the watershed that needs the most treatment. Again, it can be completed through EQIP and through CSP as well. All right, so with NWQI, they just added an additional project area, source water protection. So this, of course, includes surface and groundwater public water systems. And so this is a new special component to NWQI. Again, we assist partners in adopting and expanding source water protection and their plans related to that, where the drinking water source is surface or groundwater. So NWQI addresses threats to that drinking water, either to remediate impairments or to protect clean sources. Okay, so how does NWQI? It's very similar to MRBI in that it is a multi-year plan with a multi-year budget to demonstrate the long-term commitment in assisting the water quality efforts. The partnership is with NRCS, of course, our state water quality agencies, and the EPA. NRCS provides targeted funding for both financial and technical assistance in the HUC 12s with the most need. And practices can include things that promote soil health, reduce erosion, lessen nutrient runoff. So those are just some of the examples that these practices may involve. So the state water quality agencies and other partners contribute additional resources to the planning, the implementation, and then the outreach as well. And then they also provide efforts for monitoring and to help keep track of water quality improvements. And with that, the current watershed that we have in Minnesota is the Whiskey Creek project. Again, this project has multiple HUC 12s since they are touching one another. And lastly, you can find information about MRBI and NWQI under our national instruction. I've provided the link here, but Andrea and Yara will go into further detail of what that national instruction involves. And with that, I will have Shannon Carpenter take over.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a nice introduction to NWQI and MRBI. Thank you to everyone on all the, there's a nice round diversity of different state agency folks and NRCS folks and SWCD folks on the call. So thank you all for being here today. As Jessica said, I'm Shannon Carpenter. I'm the state water quality specialist and the technical support to NWQI and MRBI in Minnesota, as well as the technical support to our watershed subcommittee of our overall state tech committee. And I'll explain why that's an important role as I'm joining you on this call today. Next, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, the watershed assessment plans are required for NWQI or MRBI to participate, meaning the watershed plan, assessment plan, has to be completed before a watershed is eligible to enroll and implement and receive implementation dollars for NWQI and MRBI. And the assessment is based off of our NRCS area-wide planning definition. So I've got the definition on the screen. You want to hit next, Jessica? But I wanted to point out some of the terminology in the definition that may sound familiar. It's a comprehensive plan of watersheds. Next. Considers all natural resources in the planning area as well as the relevant social and economic considerations. A voluntary, locally led effort to assess their natural resource conditions and needs. Next. And the locally led effort should consider all federal, state, and local conservation programs and private sector programs. Next. So what does this remind you of? Next, a lot of things going on in Minnesota currently. So though we plan for NWQI and MRBI in the HUC 12 level, there's a lot of planning effort that happen at the state and HUC 8 levels already in Minnesota that have set us up to partner even more and more efficiently and effectively here in Minnesota because of the varying planning efforts that already exist. This is a really busy slide, but the goal of this slide is to help provide as much information as possible to those that are new to the state for NRCS as all of the resources that we have in Minnesota. There's a hyperlink in the center where the process is, where that's the Minnesota Water Framework. And that is a document that you want to get very familiar with, especially if you're new to Minnesota from an NRCS standpoint. There's a lot of different water rules in Minnesota, and that document will help navigate who's in charge of what and which agencies to seek out for further assistance. Your SWCD partner should be a really good asset as well in that, in navigating those waters as well. But for those of you, Matt Drewith, Ann Lewandowski, and Greg Johnson and I kind of put this slide together to show all of the different planning tools, assessment tools, things that are already out there on the table. And then of course the NRCS planning process over here under the local site. And we gotta, in order for NWQI and MRBI to get to that point, we have to finish this assessment process, which we have planning process already in place to help get us there. So if you have any questions in regards to terminology on this slide, please feel free to contact your area ARCs or your assistant, and I'd be happy to come and provide additional training. Next. This is another informational slide, just for those who may not know where the One Water, One Plan stands for, or TMDLs, GRAPS, that's with the Minnesota Department of Health, 319 9-element plan. Those are very important, especially if you have one of those already approved by EPA in your region. You may already be eligible for MRBI and NWQI implementation dollars. If you have one of those plans already in your region and you'd like to potentially move forward, please give me a call. Let's talk through those plans and see if it would be eligible for NWQI or MRBI. And then our Minnesota DNR folks have a ton of resources. I'm hoping this presentation will be provided to you guys. There's a lot of additional DNR links that were provided that I have in the notes section for this slide. Next. NWQI MRBI goes a little bit above and beyond what the area-wide requirements, planning requirements are. It also says that we have to utilize planning tools such as ACPF, all of the other planning tools that we have that were identified on the slide previously, down in the tools section, so that we can get to a point where we're actually getting the outcome that is necessary to move into the implementation phase of NWQI and MRBI. That is, the critical source area has been identified and the GIS data layer to support that critical source area. Next. So how do you know whether you have a existing plan that meets down to a HUC 12 level? You start by gathering the information that you currently have within the HUC 8 level plans, and to utilize to confirm your HUC 12 plan, and then you can determine whether the requirements of the NWQI MRBI watershed assessment plan have fully been met, and would you be able to put a HUC 12 plan together based on the current information that you have. And my experience with the watershed assessment plans in Minnesota to meet NWQI and MRBI, 99% of the time you will need to do additional work to get that assessment plan completed, unless you already have a 319 watershed EPA approved plan. So then if you have existing HUC 8 RAPs or One Water plans, or both preferably, the gaps should be easier to fill in, and then you can apply for what we call NWQI MRBI planning phase dollars. These are technical assistance dollars to actually help you write those plans to meet the implementation or assessment plan requirements. Next. So how do you know whether you should apply for NWQI or MRBI? This is just a slide to reiterate what Jessica already said earlier in regards to the differences between MRBI and NWQI. And really the biggest one is taking a look at that state MRBI, Minnesota Priority Focus Area Map. If you're not in the MRBI Focus Area Map, you're thinking about NWQI automatically. Now, if you're in the MRBI Focus Area, then you want to dig in. What's your purpose? Are you in a source water protection? Is the source water protection area your highest focus? Then you might still want to apply for NWQI over MRBI because there's the source water priority in under NWQI. So if you have any questions on whether you meet one or the other, please feel free to give me a call. Next. And then how do you apply? That's a good question because nationally, the watershed subcommittee is on standby until national says, hey, we're making a call for proposals. We need your state's priority or request for new planning phase or implementation phase watersheds by this deadline. And those announcements will be made on our Minnesota NRCS website. For those of our NRCS folks that are on staff, I do have approval from Troy that we will send out a notice, a memo to our internal staff before it gets posted to the statewide website. So the Minnesota Watershed Subcommittee is the subcommittee that will make the announcement, call for proposals based on the national bulletin that we get. And then we receive those applications and the subcommittee reviews those applications. And then we provide recommendations to the full state tech and to the state conservationist as to who the committee recommends to move into either planning phase or implementation phase for NWQI and MRBI. Next. So then Mr. Troy Daniels will review that request and forward those recommendations on to national headquarters, where national headquarters then receives all 50 states requests and then determines how many applications can actually be funded nationwide based on the funding that they have. So just because the state of Minnesota moves the application forward doesn't mean that we may get all of them if our watersheds don't rank out over other states or they run out of funding. So, and if you're interested, you can start now. You don't need to wait until the watershed subcommittee makes an announcement, and I'll show you why. Next. The Minnesota Watershed Subcommittee has put together what we call the Minnesota State Technical Committee Watershed Selection Criteria. And the reason why we did this created this document was to provide folks who are interested in moving into a watershed project the tools to get planning and started now, so that you know what it takes to have a good watershed project, and you're going to know how the committee is going to rank and score your application against another one. So we have really three sections of the watershed planning selection criteria. We have existing documents, whether you have a One Water plan, a RAPS plan, or a GRAPS, or any of those higher level planning efforts already completed. What's the local readiness? Do you have staffing ability? What are the partners on board? Whether there's farmer-led groups in the mix. And when I say partners, I'm talking about not only our soil and water conservation partners, but MDA, Minnesota Rural Water, DNR, MPCA staff, you name it, whoever can help contribute to that creation of the watershed assessment plan, or even the implementation side of it and the outreach side of it, which is the most critical to making these projects successful. And then we will also rank what the multiple benefits are. So is water quality is the primary purpose of these two programs, but how well does that overlap with other priorities in your region, and how are you connecting to those other partners to make this project a success? Go ahead. So what really makes a project a success? The Watershed Subcommittee has been talking about this for the last 5 years that I've been the technical support to that committee. It's led by two of our partner agencies as co-chairs, the Minnesota Department of Ag and Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And we've been talking to past projects and what made it work, what didn't. These were the things that really came up. How much planning efforts have you made ahead of time before jumping into one of these projects? Do you have a strong local partnership between partners and our NRCS key NRCS folks in those offices? Because NWQI and MRBI are specifically tied to NRCS program dollars. So that means our staff need to be on board 100% for these projects to be successful. Unified outreach efforts and local capacity to actually move these projects to the next level. And then as Stearns County SWCD and previous state cons have said, shovel-ready projects. You have a lineup of those shovel-ready projects that just need a source of dedicated funding to be able to get the projects on the ground. Next. So technical resources, I've got a couple slides of technical resources. This watershed assessment document that the Watershed Subcommittee has put together is on our Minnesota NRCS webpage. I've got the link there and a more specific link to the actual document right underneath of it. Also on the Minnesota watershed page on our Minnesota NRCS website is last year's assessment guidance documents for NWQI and MRBI, source water, MRBI, you name it. So they are still on the website for you to preview. I'm not going to say they're going to be identical when they're released in FY 2021, but at least you have last year's documents so you can have a reference as to what national office requires when submitting an application. But the Minnesota State Technical Committee watershed selection criteria is your foundation. It overlaps with national NRCS's requirements really well. So as long as you can follow through that document and prepare yourself for an application when the committee announces it, because typically when we get the announcement, we're making the announcement or the call for proposals, and you get about hopefully 25 days, but typically 25 days or less. So it could be 10 days or 25 days. It all depends on how many days we get before we had to have the information back to national office. So please let me know if you have any questions. And the biggest question that I get is, what is a critical source area? So I've provided some links here on definitions. The critical source area terminology really comes from our NRCS SEEP research that we've done across the country, and they have a framework. It really has to do with identifying the real pollution issue. So it's where you identify your resource concern and the pollution source, and the critical source is where those two bubbles overlap. So if you want to read a little more information, please go ahead to those slides. I think I have one more slide of resources for you. This is a slide of information of existing trainings on NWQI and the technical requirements from the past. So I am done. Back to you, Jessica.
All right, thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that overview of the assessment and implementation process there. So thank you. All right, up next we have Andrea Horstman to cover Conservation Stewardship Program. Andrea, you are up.
All right, good morning, everybody. Next slide. Now, through CSP, NRCS provides financial and technical assistance to participants for the conservation, protection, and improvement to natural resources. The purpose of the program is to encourage producers to address priority resource concerns and improve and conserve the quality and condition of natural resources in a comprehensive manner by undertaking additional conservation activities and improving, maintaining, and managing existing conservation activities across the entire agricultural operation in a manner that increases or extends the conservation benefits in place at the time a contract application is accepted by NRCS. Next slide. All CSP applications must meet 3 eligibility requirements: applicant, land, and stewardship. So I'm going to cover each of the 3 eligibility requirements, and I will include the additional requirements set for CSP MRBI. Now, under the applicant eligibility, the applicant must be the operator, owner, or other tenant of an agricultural operation in the Farm Service Agency. They share in the risk of producing a crop and participate in the daily management, administrative, and performance of the operation for the land included in the contract and have effective control of the land for the entire contract period. And CSP contracts are 5-year contracts. Next slide. Land eligibility, the applicant is enrolling all land under the applicant's agricultural operation. Eligible land uses under a CSP MRBI application is crop, pasture, farmstead, and associated agricultural lands. Additional land eligibility requirements under a CSP MRBI is that 50% or greater of the applicant's agricultural operation needs to be within the MRBI watershed project. Next slide. Stewardship eligibility. The planner will use the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool, known as CART, to assist with determining if the applicant's operation meets the minimum requirements set in policy for the stewardship eligibility. To meet the stewardship eligibility requirement, first an applicant needs to meet 2 resource concerns at the time of application for all land uses. This first part, the CART is assessing the existing conditions on the applicant's operation and determines if resource concerns are met based off the applicant's current management on that land use. Then to meet the second part of the stewardship eligibility, the applicant needs to meet at least 1 additional resource concern by the end of the contract. The planner will look over all the activities applicable under the CSP MRBI that will best fit for the applicant's operation and if it meets the MRBI requirements. The CART will determine if the activity scheduled will at least meet another resource concern at the end of the contract period. Under CSP MRBI, the extra requirement is that the applicant must agree to schedule at least one of the core conservation activities. The core meaning the water quality purposes, and conservation activities, meaning in CSP is conservation practices and enhancements. If the applicant is already implementing a core activity, then the planner will document it meets this MRBI requirement. Next slide. Under CSP MRBI, the 7 resource concerns to assess relating to water quality purposes that will benefit MRBI objectives are the following: concentrated erosion, field pesticide loss, field sediment nutrient and pathogen loss, soil quality limitations, source water depletion, storage and handling of pollutants, and wind and water erosion. Next slide. If the applicant meets the 3 eligibilities and additional MRBI eligibilities, the NRCS planner will rank the application in CART. For CSP MRBI, the ranking factors will be based on a required set of questions from national. The national required questions purpose is to meet the CSP regulations, program purpose, and MRBI objectives. So for example, you will define that critical source area in your MRBI proposal agreement. And one of the national required question is, does a field intersect the critical source area for MRBI watersheds? If yes, the applicant will get 80 points. So these applicants would be considered higher ranking than those operations not in the critical source area. Additional ranking questions would come from the local partners and NRCS field staff who is involved with the watershed project. These questions will be based on your watershed assessment and focus on the nutrient loss reduction strategies. Next slide. I'm not going to cover the specific details on how to determine the amount of a CSP annual payment. Just know that there are 2 types of payments under a CSP annual payment. The first type is the existing activity payments. This consists of 2 contract items. The first contract item is based off on the number of resource concerns met at the time of application, which is based off existing conditions, existing management on the operation. And the second contract item is the total amount of acres of a land use times the land use rate. So each eligible land use type has a defined payment rate. The second type is the additional activity payment, which is provided to us on a payment schedule that lists the amount of financial assistance provided for all applicable conservation activities, just like EQIP. The payment rates provided will determine how much the participant will receive on an activity after it was implemented. The payment rates for MRBI would be the same payment rates as the CSP general sign-up. And also note that we're not able to process CSP annual payments until after October, and all payments need to be processed and paid out before the end of the calendar year. Next slide. The benefits of having CSP MRBI in your local area. Less competition when competing within a MRBI watershed project compared to general CSP. Focuses on the local watershed objectives. Additional financial assistance to your local area. Next slide. If you consider CSP MRBI in your watershed proposal, and to be successful, work together. Partners and NRCS staff should work together to determine an appropriate amount of funds for each of the fiscal years. My advice would be start reviewing the data, review together the average number of CSP applications the local NRCS field office is receiving each fiscal year. Do you have large or smaller farms in your proposed area? Set an acre average to use when you determine the estimated amounts of funds. And remember to consider funding a 5-year contract for each of the applications. Outreach would be necessary because you're targeting specific water quality conservation activities. To be successful, you will need to sell CSP. In order to sell CSP, you must know the basic program requirements and then sell the popular core conservation activities required under the MRBI program for that area. So if partners want to learn more about CSP, reach out to your local field offices and consider the benefits of CSP MRBI and add it to your MRBI proposal. Thank you.
All right, Andrea, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Up next, we do have Yara Gonzalez, who will cover the EQIP portion. Yara, take it away.
Thank you, Jess. Okay, so now we're gonna be looking at the EQIP program. Next slide. So overall, EQIP provides financial and technical assistance to agricultural producers to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits. So who is eligible for EQIP? Well, farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners who own or rent agricultural land. Next slide. Okay, so MRBI and NWQI provide assistance through EQIP. So all the rules that apply for EQIP also apply to MRBI and NWQI. And these are program eligibility. Well, the applicant must have established farm records, have control or own the land, be in compliance with HEL and wetland conservation requirements. They need to meet the adjusted gross income and payment limitation provisions. Eligible land uses for these initiatives are cropland, rangeland, pastureland, farmstead, water, and associated eggland. Other land requirement for both initiatives is that 50% or greater of the planned land units need to be within the watershed to be eligible. Next slide, please. So the primary resource concerns of these initiatives are targeted to improve water quality. When developing ranking pools, the state can adjust the weighted average for these resource concerns. This allows the state to prioritize the most important resource concerns within that watershed. Next slide. Okay, so we have a list of core practices and supporting practices. Core practices must have to have a water quality purpose. The contracts that are developed under the MRBI and NWQI should include at least one core practice or must be completing a conservation system that supports core practices that are documented as already applied on the land under contract. These both initiatives put emphasis on system approach to encourage producers to implement a suite of practices to avoid, control, and trap pollutants, as we can see on this table here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so through the conservation assessment ranking tool, we develop the program questions and the resource questions to address the identified resource concerns. So we have the program questions are more national type questions, and they're geared more to meet the national goals and regulations. And then the resource questions are your local questions, and those are focused on watershed assessment, overall initiative objectives, addressing the natural resource concerns and the practices. Next slide, please. So MRBI and NWQI, the overall benefits of this initiative, having these initiatives, it's an opportunity to address local needs. It provides dedicated funding to your local area for conservation implementation. It actually also forms new partnerships and measure results of improvements. Next slide, I think that's my last slide there. Thanks.
Thank you, Yara. Appreciate that. At this point, we can take any questions that you may have. I think the easiest way to do this is maybe raise your hand, and then I will call on each of you to unmute your phone and ask your question. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we can take any verbal questions you may have. Okay, I do see that Keith and Ryan are on. Do you have anything you want to add?
I do not have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll just add a couple items here. What awesome opportunities. I know in some discussions we've had with some team leads that, like the money just doesn't go far enough for EQIP, and here's some opportunities that we could bring additional, let's say, efforts into the state, additional funding sources. But there's those catches that kind of come with it, like what Shannon talked about, Jess, Yara, and Andrea talked about too. So, we've always kind of looked at, we didn't always, but some of the watersheds that were selected in the past were kind of selected at the state level, and then they were kind of sent downward. But what we want you to do is to look at maybe this as an opportunity for your team, or maybe a couple teams that have some shared watersheds, and see if it's an opportunity that you would have capacity for, you have the partnerships for, the abilities for, to really to move forward with having a potential one of these projects in your area. Of course, you definitely want to talk to your assistant state conservationists for field operations and make sure that that's something that you and your team and your area can help facilitate. But that's kind of in a nutshell. I think this is an excellent opportunity for this to be more of a locally led type process, where you as a team, you as your county, your watershed, collaborate together to see if you have capacity, you have a readiness, you have the abilities to make one of these projects work. And eventually, like the whole point too, is to move that needle in water quality. So that's what I would add to this discussion, is that this is something that it's an informative meeting today. Take this information with you, take it back to your team, take it back to your supervisors, take it back to your local partnerships, and see if this is something that you would want to pursue. And if you do want to pursue one of these efforts, you've met the contacts today. You've met Jess, Yara, Andrea, Shannon. Meet with them and see what the next steps would be. That would be it. That's all that's what I would add to this discussion, Jess.
Appreciate that, Ryan. Thank you. We actually do have some questions rolling in on the chat. So team, be ready to help me address these. What entities are eligible to apply? Local government units only?
And Barb, I'm going to ask a clarifying question on that one before we move forward. Are you referencing the planning phase side of things? If there's not an existing watershed assessment plan already in place, we need to, at the local level, have determined you need additional dollars to help get that assessment plan wrote. Is that what your question is referencing to?
Referencing any of the opportunities, be it the readiness grant or the applying for the shovel ready practices, either one.
And if you look at the watershed assessment criteria that we put together as a watershed subcommittee, it really drives home the point of local partnerships working together. So it would be a combined effort application, and which organization takes the lead and actually submits the application doesn't really matter. I think it matters that the local partners at the ground level are all working together and have committed to making that project successful.
Thanks.
All right, Shannon, you may know best on this next question too. What are the main challenges the two programs have faced in the past?
That local conductivity. The reason why there's a lot of heavy points towards local readiness is ensuring that the NRCS and whoever else is coming to the table to assist NRCS with the planning efforts are talking to each other. So probably the weak point is applications have been submitted with implying that NRCS is on board, but when the local NRCS folks may not have fully understood what the partnership was moving forward with for an application. So it really is important that everyone at the local level is on the same page. They're supportive of the project. Otherwise, it's unlikely that it would succeed.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, when using CSP or EQIP for either watershed program, is the intent for the NRCS to provide the TA, or is that part of the partner's role? In our case, the SWCD. So Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do offer TA for the readiness plan for the partners. But then when it comes to the actual covered programs, EQIP or CSP, then NRCS typically handles the TA, and there is no reimbursable in those plans for partners. Is that correct, Shannon?
Yes.
Okay.
So the TA typically comes along with a contribution agreement to actually physically get the watershed assessment plan completed.
Thank you. Any other questions for us? Ryan's got something. Perfect.
I just want to add to Leanne's question here too. Is it like who's responsible for the TA side? And I think it's both, everyone, right? So the whole point of this is to not be NRCS is going to apply for a NWQI and that's it, and then we're on our own little island here. The point is for the partners to talk and to see what everybody can bring to the table. And that's part of that readiness phase. That's part of that capacity discussion that you have to have too. It's not just NRCS, but if we have districts that are interested in doing this and other partners that are interested in doing this and can bring some capacity to the table, that's what's going to make this a success. I think in the past, we've had some, we wanted a lot on our plate. Let's get this watershed in, but we didn't have the capacity to really deliver, because maybe we had vacancies. And like Shannon mentioned, that connectivity with the partners wasn't there. So that's going to be huge in this. So it's not just NRCS, it's not just the district, it's not you're going to do this, we're going to do that, but it's together, I think, is where you can do the biggest efforts too. And not just NRCS and the districts, but there's a whole slew of partners out there that get involved in these efforts. Source Water, MPCA, there's all those things that people talked about earlier that we definitely want to make sure that like everybody's on the same page when we move forward with at least past that readiness phase and we go into the implementation phase, right? Many hands make light work. We all do the same thing for a living, right? So let's work together and make it happen. So it would be an excellent opportunity to bring in that partnering, collaboration, capacity at that local level.
And hopefully the plans that are already in place at that HUC 8 level have identified these smaller watershed projects that people have already got a buy-in in regards to moving forward and improving water quality in their watersheds. So you shouldn't be starting from ground zero when you're working on an assessment plan moving forward to get NRCS implementation dollars for those projects. So thank you, Ryan, for your comments.
Keith, I think you have something, and then Greg, we will follow Keith once Keith is done here.
Yeah. The goal of this today was just to, enlighten people a little bit on some of the differences and opportunities here, because we get a lot of requests for, we need more EQIP, we need more CSP, and we want more local money. And State Con Daniel, and we've been trying in Minnesota to, ask for as much as we can get, ask for more every year, and there's a lot of other states in the same ballpark. So this is just an opportunity that if you are most of the way there, or in some cases all the way there already, it may be a good opportunity, like Shannon said, for locally to kind of come up with a proposal and a project to target that and then get some special funds in specific for that project. These funds we aren't able to take if we don't use them. We can't move them to other EQIP projects that's specific to MRBI or NWQI. So if we have a project, we don't use it, it's got to be sent back. So this is just a great opportunity, I think, for those partners that are working through this process to help us. And the difference between this and kind of the RCPPs and other things are that this money still comes to us. There's not the technical assistance, as was said, to the partner, but we still are going to rely heavily on that partnership to help with the reporting, the targeting, all of that stuff that's required in those planning elements that Shannon went over. That's not stuff that we are experts in or are doing. So we're relying on the partners to help us really work through this project proposal, target and focus, and then continue. So it's that partnership, as Ryan mentioned too, that's really key to this, and an opportunity that we just hope some of our partners and local offices, this will at least spark some discussion on maybe an opportunity to leverage a little bit more focused money for some of your watershed projects.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate that. Greg?
Yeah, this is Greg Johnson with the MPCA. One of the other challenges, and it really builds on what or that the solution builds on what Shannon and Ryan and Keith are saying, but the challenge being really timing, and hopefully it'll be some lessons learned. But when we first were chatting with some of the original NWQI and MRBI watersheds, one of the challenge was timing, getting the money and then having to spend it within 2 years and or 3, and then not having had the connections to the landowners and the landowners being ready to implement. And I think, as a lot of you have seen over the years, and then I think we're doing better with NWQI and MRBI now, is spending the time in terms of the readiness phase. That's been really huge. But even prior to that is, beginning to work at the smaller scale, developing the landowner relationships and the partnerships, leading into applying for either of these.
Absolutely, Greg. And the outreach piece becomes very, very critical. And in these watershed assessment plans, the outreach piece is required. And that's really where those locally led, farmer-led groups or local industry, you name it, think outside the box when it comes to partners and helping to get the word out and building those relationships so that you can have additional relationships with the farmers and get the projects on the ground.
And Greg is part of the watershed subcommittee. I'll just throw that out there. So I'm sure he or anyone else on the subcommittee would be willing to answer questions folks may have too.
Absolutely. Greg is one of our 2 watershed subcommittee co-chairs.
Alrighty, one last question and then we'll wrap up for the day here. On average, how many MRBI or NWQI HUC 12s are approved by the state in the past? That really varies. I would say really though, it's been about 1 a year now, Shannon. 1 for the readiness and then 1 for the implementation plan. So both need the approval.
Yes, but I think the guidance that we recently got from Mr. Daniels is if we have a solid plan that has solid partnerships and solid buy-in at the local level, he would be more than willing to recommend more than as many as needed to go to national headquarters. So I still think there'll be a limit to the amount we should send forward, but at least more than 1 and probably up to that 4 mark total, or 5 depending on the amount of applications we get this year and how solid those applications are. So,
and there really isn't a HUC 12 limitation as long as they're touching one another. Again, they can be a group of HUC 12s together in a project.
But when it comes to watershed assessment and why Minnesota doesn't have more of these plans completed and why we don't do HUC 8 level planning to a critical source area level, it's because there's not enough funding to do that. It takes a lot more water quality monitoring, water quality sampling to really get at what the critical source is. So we're not going to do that at a HUC 8 level because there's not enough funding amongst all of our partners to actually get there. That's where the HUC 8 level planning identifies those key HUC 12, HUC 10 level watersheds to get to that critical source area. Anything above, really above a HUC 10 might just be a little too big to really dive into a critical source and identify that critical source area. So yes, Jessica's right, but caution on how large you want to get. Take a look at the acres within those HUC 12s and how large those watersheds get.
Thanks, Shannon, for clarifying that. All right, well, we will wrap up here, but I want to thank everyone for joining today. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you do have additional questions. We will be happy to answer any questions, follow-up you may have. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to hear from some of you and review some projects ahead. Thanks.